A shotgun blast 5 years ago blew this woman's face to pieces.
In September 2004, a man walked into a bar, pointed a shotgun directly at his wife's face, and pulled the trigger. The blast was meant to end her life instantly. When the smoke cleared, he left her there on the floor, assuming she was dead. But what he didn't know was that she would survive. He thought he had erased her existence, but instead he set her on a path to make history. She wouldn't just live, she would become the first woman in the United States to receive a near-total face transplant. And years later, when he finally saw her again in a courtroom, he wouldn't even recognize the woman staring back at him. But this isn't just a story about a medical miracle, it's a story about survival in its rawest form. What could drive a man to destroy the face of the woman he once loved? And how did she come back from the unimaginable to face him one last time? To truly understand the depth of the horror that was about to unfold, we first have to understand who Connie Culp was. Before she was a headline, before she was a medical case study, she was just Connie. She lived in the small town of Hopedale, Ohio, a place where neighbors knew each other's names and life moved at a steady, quiet pace. Connie was the kind of woman who was the heartbeat of her family. She was a mother to 2 children, Stephen and Alicia, and by all accounts, she loved them with a fierce, protective energy. She was the mum who was always there, the one who tried to make every holiday special, the one who worked tirelessly to build a future for them. Friends described her as boisterous and full of life. She had a laugh that could fill a room, the kind of laugh that made you want to join in, even if you didn't know the joke. She was a hard worker too. For years she ran a painting business, spending long days on ladders and scaffolding, not afraid to get her hands dirty to help provide for her household. Eventually, she and her husband took over a local bar called Ian's Place. It seemed like a perfect fit for her personality. Connie was a people person. She loved to chat, she loved to host, and she loved being around others. To the patrons who stopped in for a drink, she was just the friendly woman behind the counter who would listen to your problems and pour you a beer. She had the same hopes and struggles as anyone else. She worried about bills. She dreamed of retirement. She wanted to see her kids grow up and have families of their own. She wasn't looking for fame, and she certainly wasn't looking for tragedy. She was simply living her life, day by day, unaware that the sand in the hourglass was running out. Looking back at the photos from that time, you see a woman with a spark in her eyes and a smile that came easily. She was relatable. She was kind. She was just like any of us. Until one moment changed everything. Then there was Thomas Culp. To understand the tragedy, we have to look at the man holding the gun. And the truth is, he didn't start out as a monster. To the community in Hopedale, Tom was a known figure. He was a father, a business owner, a man who worked alongside his wife, painting houses before they took over the bar. He had his own demons and his own struggles, but early on, the marriage appeared functional. There were shared goals and moments of genuine partnership. It's easy to look back now and see only the violence, but it wasn't always like this. There was a time when Connie felt safe with him, a time when he was the protector, not the predator. However, as the years went by, a dark pattern began to emerge. A pattern rooted in deep-seated insecurity. When they bought Ian's Place, the cracks in Thomas's personality turned into chasms. While Connie thrived on the social aspect of the bar, chatting with regulars and keeping the atmosphere light, Thomas began to resent it. He watched her. He watched the men she spoke to. He watched the way she smiled at customers. That jealousy twisted into something suffocating. It wasn't just concern, it was possession. Small incidents started to pile up. A sharp comment here, a cold shoulder there. He would accuse her of flirting or of having affairs that didn't exist. He needed to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing at every moment. The man Connie had married was slowly disappearing, replaced by someone consumed by rage and a desperate need for control. He felt his grip on her slipping, and his insecurity convinced him that every smile she gave to someone else was a betrayal. He was a man losing control of himself, and as the pressure built, the walls of their marriage began to close in. The collapse of their marriage didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing descent, a spiral that became harder and harder to escape. This is the insidious nature of domestic volatility. It's rarely just violence 24 hours a day. If it were, leaving might be an easier choice. Instead, it's a confusing cycle. There were still good days. Days where Thomas would apologize, where he would promise to be better, where he would bring flowers or act like the father and husband Connie had fallen in love with years ago. He would say he was just stressed about the business, that he was sorry for snapping, and Connie, holding on to hope and the history they shared, wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man she married was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the anger. Outsiders often ask the same question: why didn't she just leave? But untangling a life is never as simple as walking out the door. Their lives were completely knotted together. They owned the bar jointly. It was their primary source of income. If she left, she risked financial ruin. They had children to consider, a home to maintain, and a shared history that spanned years. And then there is the fear. When you live with someone whose mood can shift like the wind, you learn to survive by walking on eggshells. You learn to manage their emotions to keep the peace. You stay because you hope the storm will pass, but you also stay because you are terrified of what might happen if you try to walk away. But by the late summer of 2004, the storm wasn't passing. It was stalling directly over their heads. The tension in the Culp household had become suffocating. Thomas's accusations grew wilder and more detached from reality. He wasn't just jealous anymore. He was paranoid. He began to see enemies everywhere. Every phone call was suspicious. Every minute she was late was taken as proof of betrayal. The arguments became more frequent and more explosive, often spilling out into the bar in front of customers. The rage was no longer hidden behind closed doors. It was bleeding into every aspect of their lives. Thomas was becoming a powder keg, and the fuse was burning short. He was angry, he was irrational, and he was losing his grip on reality. The man who had vowed to protect her was now looking at her with eyes full of hate. It felt inevitable, like a train rushing toward a broken track. The screaming matches, the tears, the desperate attempts to calm him down, they were all leading to a single, irreversible point in time. The countdown had begun, though Connie had no way of knowing just how little time she had left. And then came September 21st, 2004, the day that would change everything. September 21st, 2004. It was a Tuesday in Hopedale, Ohio. The air was turning crisp with the coming autumn, the leaves just starting to think about changing colour. In the centre of town stood Ian's Place, the bar owned by Connie and Thomas. It was a modest establishment, the kind of local watering hole where the neon signs buzzed softly and the floors were worn from years of foot traffic. On any other night, the bar would be filled with the low hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the sound of a jukebox playing in the corner. But this Tuesday was quieter. The crowd was thin. Connie and Thomas were there, ostensibly to work, to manage the business they had built together. But beneath the routine of wiping down counters and checking stock, the air was thick with static. The day had not been peaceful. The arguments that had been simmering for months were boiling over again. Witnesses later recalled that Thomas seemed agitated, pacing the floor like a caged animal. His movements were jerky, his eyes darting around the room. He wasn't focused on the business. He was focused entirely on his wife. Something was different that night. It wasn't just the usual bickering. There was a dangerous weight to the silence between them. The tension was palpable, heavy enough to choke on. What was going through Thomas's mind in those final hours? He was a man convinced of a betrayal that existed only in his head. He had convinced himself that Connie was having an affair, that she was planning to leave him, that everyone in the bar was laughing at him behind his back. His paranoia had constructed a narrative where he was the victim and she was the villain. Perhaps Connie had finally stood her ground that day. Perhaps she had said something that signaled she was done with the accusations. Or maybe it was simply the silence itself that drove him mad, the refusal to engage in his circular arguments. Whatever the final trigger was, whether it was a look, a word, or just the overwhelming pressure of his own delusion, Thomas decided that the talking was over. He wasn't looking for answers anymore. He was looking for a permanent solution. The bar, their place of livelihood, was about to become a crime scene. What I am about to tell you is difficult to hear, but it is necessary to understand the magnitude of Connie's survival. The argument didn't end with words. Thomas retrieved a shotgun. He didn't fire a warning shot. He raised the weapon and pointed it directly at his wife's face from just a few feet away. He pulled the trigger. The impact was devastating. The blast shattered Connie's nose, pulverized her cheeks, destroyed the roof of her mouth, and blinded her right eye. In a split second, her face, her identity, was gone. Amidst the chaos and the horror, Thomas turned the gun on himself. He put the barrel in his mouth and pulled the trigger a second time, attempting to end his own life. But he failed. Thomas survived his self-inflicted wound with relatively minor injuries compared to his wife. As for Connie, she lay motionless on the floor. First responders and witnesses looked at the scene and assumed the worst. It looked like a murder-suicide. The damage was so catastrophic that no one believed she could possibly be alive. In that moment, Thomas Culp thought he had ended her life. He thought he had silenced her forever. But what he didn't know was that Connie was a fighter. When the sirens finally cut through the night air, the first responders arrived at a scene of absolute carnage. They moved toward Connie's body, prepared to make a pronouncement of death. But then, amidst the ruin, they found a faint, struggling pulse. She was alive. The paramedics worked with frantic urgency. The extent of her injuries was shocking even to veteran trauma teams. The shotgun blast had destroyed nearly 80% of her face. Where there should have been a nose, there was only bone and open air. Her cheeks were gone. Her upper jaw and palate were shattered into hundreds of pieces. She couldn't breathe on her own. Her airway was compromised by blood and debris. She was rushed to the hospital in a desperate race against the clock. Surgeons immediately performed a tracheotomy, cutting a hole in her windpipe just to give her lungs air. For hours, a team of doctors fought simply to stop the bleeding and stabilize her brain. Remember, Thomas lay in a hospital bed nearby, believing she was gone. He had no idea that in the trauma unit, machines were beeping, blood was being transfused, and Connie was fighting for every single breath. Outside the operating room, her family gathered in a state of shock. Her children, Stephen and Alicia, sat in the waiting room, trapped in a nightmare. They didn't know if their mother would survive the night. They didn't know if the woman behind those doors would ever come home. So all they could do was wait, pray, and hope that the fighter inside her wouldn't give up. And where was Thomas during this desperate battle for survival? He was in the same hospital system, recovering from injuries that paled in comparison to his wife's. His suicide attempt had left him scarred, but very much alive. As soon as he was stable, the handcuffs went on. He was charged with attempted aggravated murder. But as the legal process began to turn, the question everyone wanted answered was simple. Did he show remorse? Did he beg to know if the woman he supposedly loved was going to make it? The reality was far colder. We saw a man retreating into silence and self-preservation. There was no grand apology, no desperate plea for forgiveness. What kind of man could look at his wife, pull the trigger, and then, when the plan for a quick exit failed, simply sit back and wait for his lawyer? It paints a picture of profound selfishness and cowardice. He had tried to play God, deciding when Connie's life should end. Then, he tried to take the coward's way out to escape the consequences. But in the ultimate twist of irony, he failed at everything. He failed to kill her, and he failed to kill himself. He couldn't even manage to escape the judgment that was coming for him. Now he would have to live to face the wreckage he had created. Connie survived the night. But when she woke up, the nightmare was just beginning. The bullet hadn't killed her, but it had stolen her life as she knew it. Her reality was now one of profound physical limitation. Without a nose, she couldn't smell the flowers in her garden or the coffee in the morning. Without a palate or upper lip, she couldn't eat solid food. She subsisted on liquids sipped through a straw. She couldn't speak clearly, her words muffled and distorted. Even breathing was a struggle, relying on the tube in her throat. But the psychological trauma was perhaps even deeper. Imagine the first time she looked in a mirror. The face looking back wasn't hers. It was a landscape of scars, twisted skin, and emptiness. The world outside her hospital room became a cruel place. When she ventured out, children would hide behind their parents' legs in fear. Strangers would stare, whisper, or turn away in disgust. She became a prisoner of her own appearance, hiding behind dark sunglasses and scarves, isolated and ashamed. Even her own family had to learn how to look at her without flinching, masking their heartbreak with brave smiles. For years she endured this existence. She underwent 30 agonizing surgeries. Doctors took bone from her ribs and skin from her legs, trying desperately to patch the damage. But no matter what they did, they couldn't give her back a face. She was a medical anomaly, a survivor existing in the shadows. It begs the question, she survived. But was this life? But then, just when it seemed like this dark, hidden existence was her permanent fate, something extraordinary happened. A door opened to a possibility that sounded like science fiction, something that had never been done before in the United States. Enter Dr. Maria Siemiano and her elite team at the Cleveland Clinic. They were on the cutting edge of reconstructive medicine, and they proposed a solution so radical it sounded impossible: a face transplant. At its core, the procedure involves taking the face of a deceased donor, skin, muscle, nerves, arteries, and bone, and grafting it onto the recipient. But this isn't like transplanting a kidney. The face is our identity. It's how we communicate, how we express emotion. The complexity of connecting microscopic nerves so a person can smile again is staggering. The risks were terrifying. Connie's body could reject the new face, attacking it as a foreign invader. The massive doses of immune-suppressing drugs could leave her vulnerable to fatal infections. There was a very real chance she could die on the operating table. But Connie didn't hesitate. After years of hiding, of drinking her meals, of being looked at like a monster, she was ready to gamble everything. She told the doctors plainly she would rather die trying to get her life back than continue living the way she was. The wait for a donor was agonizing, but in December 2008, a match was found. A woman named Anna Casper had passed away, and her family, in a moment of profound grace, agreed to the donation. They gave Connie a second chance at life. The surgery was a marathon. For 22 grueling hours, a team of surgeons worked in shifts, meticulously connecting blood vessels thinner than a strand of hair. It was a procedure that had never been successfully completed in the United States. The medical world held its breath. The question hanging in the air wasn't just if the surgery would work, but if Connie Culp would survive it at all. On December the 10th, 2008, the world waited. Inside the operating room, history was being written, stitch by stitch. Outside, her family sat in that familiar, terrifying limbo, wondering if they had said their last goodbyes. But then, the doors opened. The news broke. She had made it. Connie Culp had a new face. It wasn't an immediate fairy tale ending, it was the start of a grueling climb. When she woke up, her face was swollen and stiff. But for the first time in 4 years, she had a nose, she had a chin, she had cheeks. The recovery was a process of rediscovery. Slowly, the nerves began to knit together. Imagine the overwhelming emotion of the first time she could smell a cup of coffee again, The first time she could taste a slice of pizza, her first solid meal since the attack. She had to relearn the things we all take for granted: how to move her lips, how to articulate words, and eventually, how to smile. The most powerful moment came when she asked for a mirror. She looked into the glass and didn't see a monster. She saw a person. It wasn't the face she was born with, but it was a face she could live with. When her children walked into the room, they didn't have to look away. They saw their mother, whole again. Connie didn't hide anymore. She stepped out of the shadows and into the spotlight. Her story captivated the globe. She held press conferences, showing the world her scars and her triumph. She became a symbol of impossible hope for burn victims and trauma survivors everywhere. The irony was absolute. The woman Thomas Culp tried to erase, the woman he tried to silence with a shotgun blast, was coming back louder and stronger than ever before. But the story doesn't end in the hospital. It ends with a reckoning. Years later, the timeline of justice finally circled back. Thomas Culp, who had been serving a 7-year sentence for the attack, was due for release proceedings, but the dynamic had shifted tectonically since he first went away. Imagine the scene. The courtroom was hushed, the air thick with anticipation. Thomas sat at the defense table, the man who had pulled the trigger, the man who had known his wife only as the victim he left bleeding on the barroom floor. Then the doors opened. Connie walked in. She wasn't hiding behind sunglasses. She wasn't looking down at the floor. She walked in with her head held high, wearing the face of a stranger, yet carrying the spirit he thought he had broken. The moment their eyes met was electric. Did he even recognize her? The shock must have been paralyzing. He was looking at a medical miracle, a living testament to his failure to destroy her. She stood before the court and before him, not as a victim, but as a survivor. The irony was devastating. He had tried to obliterate her identity, to take away her ability to be seen. Instead, she stood there with a new identity, one that was famous around the world for its resilience. While Thomas had spent years in a cell, likely crafting justifications for his actions, Connie had been rebuilding. When it came time to address the court, her presence spoke louder than any legal argument. She was living proof of his brutality, but also living proof that she could not be defeated. Did he show remorse in that moment? Did he apologize for stealing her face? By most accounts, the man who once controlled her every move was now small, diminished by the magnitude of her strength. He had lost his power. He had lost his wife. And as he looked at her new face, he surely realized he had lost the war he started that night in the bar. Connie's story forces us to stop and confront the uncomfortable, darker questions that lurk beneath the surface of relationships. We have to look at the patterns, the jealousy that masquerades as love, the control that tightens slowly, like a noose. We often ask in hushed tones, what could she have possibly done to make him snap like that? It is a trap we fall into, trying to find a reason for the unreasonable. But the answer is stark and simple: nothing. There is nothing a wife, a partner, or a human being can do to deserve having a shotgun pointed at their face. We have to dismantle the instinct to victim blame. Thomas Culp didn't pull that trigger because of anything Connie did. He pulled it because of his own psychology, a toxic mix of rage, ownership, and a terrifying need for control. He viewed her not as a person, but as a possession. And when he felt that possession slipping, he decided that if he couldn't have her, no one would. His fatal mistake wasn't just missing the shot that was meant to kill her. His mistake was underestimating her. He assumed she would die. And if she lived, he assumed she would stay silent, hidden away in shame. But she refused. The tragedy is that Connie is not alone. Every day, thousands of people are trapped in the same cycle of fear and violence. The statistics are staggering, but behind every number is a name, a face, and a story. Connie's journey is a beacon for them. It is a message of empowerment that screams, there is a way out, there is hope, and there is a life waiting on the other side of the darkness. So what happened to Connie after the cameras turned away and the court cases ended? She didn't retreat. She lived. For nearly 12 years, she walked the earth with her new face, embracing the second chance she had fought so hard for. She became a fierce advocate for organ donation, traveling to speak about the gift of life. She spoke openly to survivors of domestic violence, telling them, "Do not let people judge you. You are beautiful." She spent time with her children and her grandchildren, savoring the simple moments that had almost been stolen from her. She represented a monumental medical breakthrough, proving that face transplants could not only succeed, but could restore humanity to those who had lost it. Sadly, in July 2020, Connie passed away at the age of 57 due to an infection unrelated to her transplant. But her death was not the end of her story. Her impact lives on in medical textbooks, in the lives of the patients who came after her, and in the courage of every survivor who hears her name. Her life came full circle. She began as a victim in a pool of blood on a barroom floor. She rose to become a survivor, and she ascended to become a pioneer. Thomas Culp may have fired the shot, but Connie Culp refused to let him have the last word. When we look back at the arc of Connie's life, we see a journey that defies logic. It takes us from the terrified silence of a barroom floor to the defiant strength of a courtroom, and finally, to the pages of history. There were two faces of Connie Culp. There was the face she was born with, the one Thomas destroyed in a fit of jealous rage. And then there was the face she reclaimed, the one that became a symbol of a medical miracle. The ultimate irony of this tragedy is profound. Thomas pulled that trigger to silence her, to render her invisible, to assert his final dominance over her existence. But in doing so, he achieved the exact opposite. He didn't make her invisible. He made her unforgettable. He didn't silence her. He gave her a voice that resonated around the globe. Connie's life teaches us a lesson about the limits of human cruelty and the boundlessness of human resilience. It shows us that while science can repair the body, it is the spirit that survives the trauma. If you take only one thing from this story, let it be this. No matter how shattered you feel, my friend, you can be put back together. And if you are watching this, and you see yourself in the early chapters of Connie's story, if you are walking on eggshells, if you are living in fear of the person who is supposed to love you, please know that you are not alone. There is help, and there is a way out. You do not have to wait for the tragedy to happen before you choose survival. Connie fought for every breath she took. She fought through pain we can't imagine just to stand in the sun one more time. She proved that the power of not giving up is the strongest force on earth. Thomas Culp pulled that trigger thinking he had won. He thought he had the final say, but he was wrong, because Connie Culp showed the world that even when someone tries to destroy you completely, you can rebuild, you can survive, and ultimately, you can win. If her story moved you, please hit the like button and share this video to help honor her memory. Her face may have changed, but her spirit never broke. If you need help, please look at the resources on your screen now. Thanks for watching.